So tell me, what is your favorite scary movie? Welcome to Coffin Talk, Episode 3. In this episode, we focus on Scream 7. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Coffin Talk. And because it's kind of hard to see in this thing, and it's kind of hot, we're going to do the reveal right now. Welcome to Act 3. Oh, it was me the whole time. Oh my goodness. I look good. But we're going to do a little wardrobe change. See? That is much better. Welcome everybody to my Scream 7 meta-analysis, where we're going to take a comprehensive deep dive into the film, analyzing its literary elements and talking about the franchise and its future, and also seeing, what led up to this. So we're going to really take this deep dive into Scream 7 and figure out what was it about this film that was different. How did a 7th installment in a slasher franchise end up becoming the highest grossing film in the franchise in the box office by earning over $200 million. It was a triumphant return of Neve Campbell as Sidney Prescott in the franchise that she helped develop, and actually got paid for it, because the reason why she wasn't in Scream 6 is because they refused to pay her what she was worth. So she sat one out, came back, and delivered the most successful financial Scream entity in the franchise for Scream 7. That is a remarkable feat. So join me now as we take this deep dive and figure out what makes this film one of my favorite scary movies. Throughout slasher film history, the concept of the final girl has been an archetype that has remained just as important to the genre as the killer itself. Neve Campbell first portrayed Sidney Prescott in 1996's Scream, which was a genre-changing film that brought forth a resurgence of films in the slasher horror genre. 30 years after the original film, we find ourselves back at the Stu Macher house as we are introduced to our opening kill victims, Scott and Madison. My initial impression of this couple is that they have a very excellent chemistry, and Scott represents both the true crime obsession of modern audiences and the insensitivity of our society, which has adopted, just this insensitive, reaction in the age of technology. Madison and Scott share many great moments, and initially I found myself really vibing with their chemistry. As the opening sequence plays out, their chemistry is so natural, you almost forget that you're watching a Scream film, where the opening scene always ends with a brutal attack. And aside from Scream 5, these are horrific deaths, which are usually the catalyst for the rest of the film. So Ghostface in this opening, he is completely focused. Not only does he toy with his victims, he also sets fire to the iconic Macher house, which symbolically represents the flawed passing of the torch expectation that general audiences have come to expect from reboots and requels. Scream has never been a franchise that is destined to pass the torch to another generation. These films are always about one thing, and that is Sidney Prescott. Scream 4 did something very similar to this, as a new generation was seemingly poised to take over the franchise, but it was all a Ghostface level red herring, as all but one of the new generation's characters were brutally murdered, and we didn't find out that character survived until a decade later. Scream 4's motivation and deception of Ghostface's claiming that Sidney was not the star any longer, as her ingenue days were over. Similarly, in this film, Ghostface notes that Sidney is past her prime, and in both iterations, Sidney Prescott comes back to them with her iconic, witty lines. In Scream 4, it's don't. With the original, it's this one, past my prime, you, right? She's such a wonderful, wonderful character we have here. Alrighty, so Sidney, she just remains wholeheartedly the ultimate slasher film final girl, and it's through that quick wit and the intuition that she shows throughout this film. In fact, a large part of Scream 7's plot and conflict revolve around Sydney's ultimate dilemma of fighting Ghostface while protecting her family. Throughout the film, there is heavy symbolic imagery providing metaphors for Sydney's current state of life. The beautiful home she built is everything a person could want. There's a loving husband, she's got beautiful children. It's a nice house with all the modern trimmings of technology and aesthetic pleasures that we could ever want in 2026. However, there is subtle hints in the background. You will notice that the house is actually under construction. This is a metaphor for a home that is not fully realized. While Sydney may have written her autobiography Out of Darkness, there still lingers a shadow that she cannot escape, a truth that she must come to accept. And this is where the brilliance of Scream 7 really shines through. The original Scream was written by Kevin Williamson. The franchise is known for being Wes Craven's final main horror series, with the fourth film being his final film prior to his death. In part 7, we have Williamson on board to both write and direct the film. This provided several homages to prior films, as Williamson has had a part in the development of nearly every Scream iteration on screen. So we find ourselves once again in a theater metaphor. Sydney is once again Cassandra, waiting to be activated. Throughout the film, you see how prepared Sydney is. There are subtle moments, but she has not let her guard down one bit. Like Cassandra, the brilliant metaphor of part 2, Sydney knows what's coming as soon as attacks begin. She is ready to leave town too, not only to protect her family, but also to prevent any innocent people from dying, because that's who she is. She is our Scream Queen. She now knows how this story is going to play out, and she reminds us throughout the film. Now, one of the criticisms I have seen in part 7 is the reserved nature of Sidney Prescott. However, upon deeper analysis, Sydney is never afraid of Ghostface. Her hesitations in the film come only when her daughter is present, and she knows that if she gets incapacitated, then her daughter may die. It is fascinating to see how the filmmakers approach this aspect of Sydney's life. You can actually draw comparisons of it to Halloween 2018's Laurie Strode and how she raised her daughter Karen in that film. Laurie, her approach to raising her daughter was to teach her how to fight offensively, right? Offensively. She was on the attack. And Sydney is much more into defense. She taught Tatum how to fight defensively. And throughout the film, you see the subtle hints of this. Whenever Ghostface first has Tatum by the throat, and then Mark sees her and he yells down, and all of a sudden, boom, Tatum, she immediately knows what to do. Mark attacks, Sydney attacks. They've got this all planned out. The safe room, all planned out. Even going down to the final fight, the final confrontation, the subtle eye movements and, knowing what was going on. They have rehearsed and they have practiced this all defensively. It's the offense part that Sydney lacked, whereas with Laurie, she alienated her daughter because she taught her how to fight so offensively, right? She was on offense the entire time. It's interesting. All right, so in thinking about those comparisons between the two, we have what we now face in the current state of horror films, which is the era of reboots, which has been around for a long time, but also the era of requels and also of legacy sequels, which is what Scream 5, 6, and now 7 has become. So one of the things that really sets this film apart is the relationship between Sydney and her daughter Tatum. So that relationship is deeply complex, with Sydney trying to protect her daughter from Ghostface and a tragedy that has haunted her for decades. What makes 7 work so well is the continued dynamic in the franchise is known for, and that is the legacy of mothers. Sydney's entire life was upended by the deceptive actions of her mother. Sydney's mom's infidelity has been a presence of all the films. The fear to not become your mother, especially when you discover she wasn't who you thought she was, it's such a powerful driving force of the Scream franchise. Now for Tatum, it's actually the reverse. Unlike Sydney, who discovered her mother's darkness over time, Tatum has full access to everything there is to know about Sydney. However, the only thing she doesn't have access to is the ability to ask questions and get answers, genuine answers from Sydney Prescott, on whatever she's curious about. However, one of the greatest things though is that finally we do get to get some answers to some questions when Gail and Sydney, for the first time in 30 years, they grant the interview that Gail has been wanting, for 3 decades. And it's all in this film, guys. The film is packed with metaphors, it's packed with symbolism. In fact, what has set Scream apart from its fellow slasher icons has been its ability to remain grounded in a consistent story with quality production and respect for the franchise. Every moment builds into the characterization that was begun 30 years ago when Casey Becker first answered that fatal phone call. When Ghostface calls Sydney this time, she's actually unfazed by his threats. And the biggest twist of all, however, comes whenever the AI phone call starts and we see Stu Macher, of all Ghostface. We go back to the original. Scream has been ingenious in its integration of modern day technology to advance its story. In the age where we can ping locations, it is increasingly harder to create helpless situations for victims in slasher films that we know need to be savagely murdered for the story to continue. However, once AI gets involved in this film, the tone starts to shift. Because as an audience member, Scream has always been realistic. There are no supernatural elements at work here. The Ghostface that comes back every movie is not the same Ghostface from the film before. They're all different. The people wearing a costume. This is not Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees or Freddy Krueger, who we can kill multiple times and we know another movie's coming out. This is probably the most realistic of all the film franchises for the slashers, right? People do not come back from the dead in Scream. Or have they? Scream 5 has Easter eggs that are sprinkled throughout, and there are 2 of them that are of note. And it's during the scene when Richie is looking at the YouTube, he's studying the stab movies, and you see 2 little Easter eggs. One of them says it's an interview with Kirby Reed, survivor of the Woodsboro attack, whatever, which confirmed to us as an audience member that Kirby actually survived Scream 4, which was always something we thought about because we never really saw her die, just left for dead. But in the same little, the YouTube videos there's another Easter egg, and it talks about, is Stu Macher really dead? Could he possibly be alive? And that's where the requels started to really plant the seeds for the Scream films and what, we would see in a Scream 5, 6, 7, and possibly beyond. Because they were laying the groundwork, they were planting the seeds of doubt for Stu Macher the entire time. So when we go back to, the Scream 5, we're in the Macher house. Stu's relative is murdered in this one. In the next one, you have the shrine, right? And a lot of it deals with Billy and Sam, but there's a reason for that. But what I'm saying is talking about Stu specifically, because in part 6, they do focus a lot on Stu and talk about the TV and the possibility that he could be alive. So they've been planting the seeds for him to be, brought back for a while. Now, when Scream 7 was initially announced and they started to announce the cast and Matthew Lillard was listed as one of the cast members, my first thought was they're using AI, he's going to be a deep fake, and that's what they're going to use to trick Sydney. And I went into the movie completely believing that. As the movie started, Sydney even believes that. And so it's not a trick that works. However, it does start to towards the end of the film, which is very, very brilliant on their part. But one thing you notice is that Sydney, she is actually never afraid of this Ghostface, ever. Now, it's packed with metaphors and symbols, right? We talked about the production value is always there. Scream films, you know what you're gonna get when you go in there. Now, when we talk about those Easter eggs, we know that Kirby showed up in part 6. So what is the payoff for Stu, right? As City said in part 4, you don't with the original. And in 5 and 6, while a new direction and, we're going in a completely different generation, they were being developed, the original has always very much been a part of the DNA of these films. When Sydney realizes Stu could be alive, she doesn't believe it, but she takes no chances. She immediately rushes to the high school and activates a police force led by her husband, Mark Evans. Sydney is fully prepared and ready to fight. Now, the theater scene provides a pivotal moment for understanding and significance to this film. This is not a passing of the torch film. McKenna Grace brilliantly portrays the character Hannah, who evokes both Sydney's star ability and Tatum Riley, who was the supportive best friend to Sydney back in the original. Hannah, in a traditional Scream film, should have survived a lot longer. In fact, this is the true aspect of this film, is that all of this new generation are going to savagely be murdered. Each one of them has the potential to be the star, and they have the potential to be the focal point of their own Scream movie. However, they are not in their own Scream movie because this is not about them, and it's not even about Tatum. It is and has always been about Sidney Prescott. And this Ghostface is going to make sure that Sidney Prescott remembers that as well. Now, Hannah's death opens with her song, which states, "Be not afraid, don't run away. It's meant to be. I'll show you that you're capable, beautiful." And this becomes a metaphorical message to Tatum and Sydney as they find themselves in a Ghostface attack. Additionally, the trauma Sydney lives with is clearly evident in the brilliant setup here. Like her late best friend Tatum Riley, Hannah, who has final girl energy in her, is hanging there helpless. She is then brutally murdered. It's the best friend taken out. Sydney arrives, and that moment you feel it. You can feel that in this experience, this version of Sidney Prescott is the Scream Queen that could have saved her best friend Tatum Riley 30 years ago. If she just had the experience and the skill set and the fight, she could have prevented her best friend from dying. And this is where the beauty of Scream 7 starts to really take play, because we start playing with that emotion. Because as Sydney goes in there screaming for her daughter Tatum, she then sees the image of Hannah hanging there in the theater, dead, helpless, the way she found her own best friend. Now her daughter's best friend has suffered a similar fate, but had Sydney just arrived 1 second sooner, Hannah might have survived. And that's further adding to the tragedy and the trauma that is Sidney Prescott. Because again, like Cassandra, she can see it, but she cannot stop it. And she was 1 second away, literally 1 second away, from getting into that theater and stopping that murder. And again, Hannah as a character evokes both Sidney Prescott and Tatum. And as Tatum Evans' best friend, Sydney knows who this girl is. She knows her completely, because that's how mothers know their children's friends, right? They become part of the family too. And Sydney doesn't hesitate. As soon as she sees that scene, she starts firing her gun and without hesitation leads the police in the chase. It's just incredible. This scene, again, it not only alludes to the similarity of Tatum Riley's death, but it also reactivates officially that metaphor for Cassandra. And then Tatum's dilemma with Sydney grows as she cannot seem to escape the shadow of her mother, the fighter, the star. And we must talk about the interaction that Tatum has with her drama teacher, because that guy was insane. But you think about it. When Sydney was in high school, when she went to college, she was a star in theater, right? And then as this adult, Tatum has to live underneath the shadow of this ultimate Scream Queen. And she's trying her hardest to understand her mother and even follow in her footsteps, because she's also in the play, but she's playing the dog. And the theater teacher even tells her she doesn't have the energy of the dog, like basically cutting her down at every single moment he gets. And this is a recurring thing where Tatum just keeps getting it and getting it and getting it. Like, you're not your mother. The way Sydney got it, or the way Sydney wanted to get it back in the day, where like, I'm not my mom, right? I'm not going to do those terrible things. Now you have Tatum saying, I want to be like my mom. I want to be a fighter. And after Hannah's death, they do share that scene in the house where Hannah's like, I want to be like you. I want to be strong. But then she brings up Tatum, the namesake, right? Tatum Riley for the first time, and tells her mom, you know, you named me after a victim. I don't want to end up like that person, that victim you named me after. Because that's what you think of me. You think that I am a victim, that I'm helpless. And when we finally get the payoff at the end of the film, that's where the waterworks come in, because no, Sydney did not name you Tatum because Tatum Riley was weak. She named you Tatum Riley because for 30 years, several audience members like myself have been waiting for acknowledgement for this character's death and it's the importance that she had and the effect on Sydney, because she really did in the you know, Rose McGowan and the little moments that she was in Scream, the first one, had a lasting impact, you know, on this franchise. And it's still felt because Tatum is, Sydney never acknowledges her until this film, but in part 2 she's acknowledged because Gail lists her as, you know, when they're trying to figure out the killer's pattern. In the third one, Stone, the bodyguard for Jennifer Jolie, makes fun of Tatum. He kind of makes a joke about it in there. In part 4, there's an allusion to it whenever Jenny Randall is killed in the garage. And there was a deleted scene when Olivia Morris was, you know, her body was being taken away. And there was a garage door or some kind of element on, you know, this Ghostface had set up on her body. So again, another, you know, thing about Tatum. And in part 5, Dewey actually has her ashes, you know, at his home. And you see that for the very first time. We see, like, now Dewey's acknowledging her. And then in the 6th film, her clothes, her costume from when she dies in the garage are there in the shrine. So Tatum Riley has always played a significant role in these Scream films. She just hasn't been present because the character died in the first one. But remember what I said earlier, we know that Tatum had to die in order for Billy and Stu to enact their plan, which just makes her even that more important. Because you start thinking about why were Dewey and Gail so protective of Sydney, right? When they didn't have to be. But for Dewey, he had to be. Not because, you know, he loved Sydney, but he did, and they were friends, but because that was his baby sister's best friend. And you can see how close they probably were with the 2-bedroom thing I discussed earlier. And the fact that Tatum died, knowing full well that if given the opportunity, she would have died fighting for Sydney. And in a way, you could even argue that she did. Once she realized it was the killer, she didn't hold back, you know, in fighting back on him. But it's just such a misconception that Sydney's daughter, Tatum, has about why she's named Tatum. And it's interesting how you can carry a whole film with this question, because that's what they just did. And they didn't just do it, you know, haphazardly. They did it in a way that produced the highest grossing film in the franchise at $200 million. They did it in a way that Neve Campbell was able to come back to the franchise after sitting out because of pay dispute, and then delivered one of the highest, or actually the highest grossing box office in the franchise's history. This is a 30-year-old franchise, slasher film, 7th entry. This is unheard of, the level of success that this movie just made. Part 5 and 6, you can even argue, like, because of the star power they got with Jenna Ortega, even, I wouldn't even say Melissa Barrera, but I think, you know, she, you know, is also up there. You know, and then you had the nostalgia piece. It was like a perfect storm to bring Scream back. But then where do you go from there? Because once the novelty runs off with the Carpenter sisters, then there's no history backing them up aside from the Billy connection. This one says, okay, we're going back to the original. We're going back to basics. We're bringing back our original final girl. Because like we said in Scream 4, you don't with the original. Correct? All right. So now, with Hannah, the filmmakers also brought on the meta vibe of previous Scream films. While this film largely leaves the meta-analysis of slashers alone, the filmmakers did toy with the audience members by releasing the marketing materials that showed Hannah wearing a plaid skirt. And as we all know, us Scream fans are little sleuths of ourselves, and we start to analyze things a lot. And we noted at some point that, oh my goodness, all these Ghostface killers at some point in the movie when they weren't Ghostface were wearing plaid. And so there was the image that came out of McKenna Grace, in the plaid skirt, and we all assumed, I don't think I ever assumed it was her, but we assumed, oh, she might be one of the killers because she's wearing the plaid, and that's a giveaway in these movies because we know the rules, but the filmmakers tricked us in saying, hey, you may think you know the rules, but they changed. We're keeping you on your toes this time, right? The character of Hannah serves her purpose. She tells the audience exactly what Ghostface is telling us, that this is not about the new generation, and Scream has never been about passing the torch to a new generation. It has always been about Sidney Prescott. To their credit, these characters have a lot of potential. They are likable. They are well developed, and there is dynamics in here that do show the potential for a good Scream movie. In fact, if this were a passing the torch type film, these characters could carry their own film or even several series of films. However, Ghostface is clear it's not about them, and he is quick to dispose of them. And in their deaths, it's not personal, except perhaps for Lucas. And the past generation, the bridge between parts 5 and 6, they're here to help. However, again, it's not about them. In fact, it's all about Sydney, and the way we get to Sydney is through her daughter Tatum, and her friends are just obstacles. Tatum does face several struggles, such as with her drama teacher and her overbearing parents. She has a lot to overcome, and there are tense moments throughout this film where Tatum is in complete danger. Once Gale Weathers arrives on the scene, we enter Act 2, where the investigation begins and Ghostface enacts his plan to take out Sydney's support. As all Ghostface know, Sydney's biggest support has always been her friends. So Gale and Sydney set a trap for Ghostface to try and lure him out through an interview. However, in this interview, Gale does take it too far when she brings up the tragic death of Sydney's childhood friend, Tatum Riley. Tatum, as we all know, is the girl that Sydney chose to name her daughter after. Tatum was Sydney's best friend. Tatum was the last person that Sydney trusted. And Sydney remembers when she found Tatum's dead body hanging from that garage door. She was an unfortunate casualty in the darkness. Also, Sydney faces the guilt of knowing that Gale suffered nerve damage at the hands of Ghostface in New York. When it comes to our Ghostface in this film, Jessica, she is completely insane. Her motive is also completely insane. However, it perfectly suits a generation where people rely on influencers for self-help advice. To sum it up, Scream 7 is really a wonderful film. My final rating is 5 out of 5. Scream 7 earned $200 million at the box office 30 years after the first film. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video, subscribe and leave a comment, and we can continue the discussion because although this video may be over, the coffin is always open. See y'all next time.